They kicked a poor old black man out of the store, then learned he was the billionaire owner. It started as an ordinary afternoon in a high-end boutique, the kind of place where the scent of expensive leather and polished wood filled the air. The store was pristine, its shelves lined with designer goods, and the staff moved with the air of superiority that often comes with catering to the ultra-wealthy. It was a place where exclusivity wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. That's why, when an old black man walked in, dressed in worn-out clothes and shoes that had seen better days, the employees barely hid their disdain. The moment he stepped through the doors, the judgment was instant. They glanced at each other, exchanged smirks, and whispered behind the counter. He didn't belong here. At least, that's what they thought. One of the employees, a young white man in a tailored suit, was the first to act. He walked over with a forced smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes, and asked, "Can I help you with something?" His voice carried a tone that barely concealed his real message. "You shouldn't be here." The old man nodded, his gaze moving over the store with quiet curiosity. "Just looking," he said simply. But his response wasn't good enough. The employee's smile faded, and his patience thinned. "Sir, this store is for exclusive clientele. Maybe I can suggest a place more suited to your needs." The old man didn't react right away. He simply looked at the young employee, studying his face as if searching for something. There was no anger in his expression, no frustration, just a quiet understanding. But the other employees had already taken notice. A blonde woman behind the counter scoffed loudly, nudging her co-worker. "This isn't a charity," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for the old man to hear. Another employee, an older white man with graying hair, stepped forward. His years in the industry had given him a sixth sense for identifying wealth, and to him, this man had none of it. He made a show of adjusting his expensive watch as he cleared his throat. "Sir, we have a policy," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We don't allow loitering. If you're not planning on making a purchase, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The old man still didn't respond. Instead, he walked slowly to a display case, his fingers lightly grazing the glass. It was as if he was testing them, waiting to see how far they would go. And they didn't disappoint. One of the younger employees, frustrated by his silence, stepped forward aggressively. "Did you hear him? We're asking you to leave. You're making our other customers uncomfortable." Other customers? As if there were any. The store was practically empty, aside from the staff and a couple browsing in the back. But the lie didn't matter. The goal was clear: to make this man feel unwelcome, to remind him of the unspoken rules that govern spaces like this. But the old man didn't move. Instead, he smiled. It was a small, almost amused smile. And for a brief second, the employees hesitated. There was something in his eyes, something that didn't match his appearance. It was confidence. "I was actually planning on making a purchase," he said finally, his voice calm, unwavering. "But I think I've changed my mind." The employees exchanged glances, confused. What did he mean by that? What purchase? They had already decided that he had no money, that he was just another poor black man who had wandered into a place he didn't belong. The old man turned toward the exit, walking with the same slow, deliberate pace he had entered with. He reached for the door, but before he left, he said one last thing, something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. "You should treat your customers better, especially the ones you don't recognize." And with that, he was gone. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the employees erupted into laughter. "What a joke!" The young man sneered. "Like he could afford anything in here." The blonde woman chuckled, shaking her head. "Did you see his shoes? They were falling apart." They thought it was over, but they had no idea who they had just humiliated. The next day, everything changed. A black SUV pulled up in front of the boutique, its engine purring like a predator waiting to strike. The employees barely noticed at first, too busy chatting about their plans for the evening. But when the doors opened, they stopped cold. Out stepped men in suits, real suits, the kind tailored to perfection, worn by people who made decisions that shaped the world. And then he stepped out, the same old black man they had thrown out the day before. Only this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him was a team of lawyers, assistants, and business partners. And on his wrist, where there had been nothing the day before, was a watch worth more than the entire store. The employees were frozen, their faces pale. The blonde woman's mouth opened and closed, as if she was struggling to find words. The old man didn't say anything at first. He simply walked past them, as if they didn't exist, and made his way to the center of the store. Then, finally, he spoke. "I believe I own this place." The room fell into stunned silence. And then reality set in. The billionaire owner of this entire chain of luxury boutiques had walked into his own store, dressed like an ordinary man, and they had kicked him out. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. The young employee who had first approached him felt his knees go weak. The older man, who had smugly told him to leave, looked like he wanted to disappear. The billionaire's voice was calm, but there was something sharp beneath the surface. "I wanted to see how my staff treats people. Now I know." No one spoke. No one moved. And then, in the coldest, most emotionless tone they had ever heard, he delivered the final blow. "You're all fired." The weight of his words sank, and instantly, the blonde woman gasped. The young employee stumbled back. The older man tried to stammer out an apology, but the billionaire had already turned his back. There was no shouting, no dramatic outburst, just a quiet, undeniable truth. They had judged him by the color of his skin, by the way he dressed, by their own narrow expectations of what wealth looked like. And they had lost everything because of it. As he walked out, his team followed. The employees stood in stunned silence, watching their futures crumble. And in that moment, they learned a lesson they would never forget. Because racism doesn't just cost people their dignity. Sometimes it cost them everything. The weight of their mistake crushed them, but there was nothing they could do. The billionaire had spoken, and his decision was final. The staff stood frozen, their luxurious surroundings now feeling suffocating. The store, once a place where they held power over who was worthy and who was not, had turned into a prison of their own making. They had judged a man by his appearance, dismissed him without a second thought, and now they had lost everything. The young employee, the one who had first approached him with fake politeness, felt a cold sweat run down his back. He had been working here for years, priding himself on his ability to read customers, to determine who was worth his time and who wasn't. But now, as he looked at the black SUV pulling away, he realized how blind he had been. He had thought himself smart, clever, superior. But in reality, he had been the fool. The blonde woman, whose sneers had been the loudest, collapsed onto a stool behind the counter. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter, trying to process what had just happened. She had laughed at the man, mocked him for his worn-out shoes, whispered to her co-workers about how he didn't belong. And now, she was the one being cast out. The irony was brutal. The older employee, the one who had confidently told the man to leave, swallowed hard. His years of experience, his self-proclaimed ability to spot real wealth, had amounted to nothing. He had spoken with arrogance, convinced that he was protecting the exclusivity of the store. But now, the very man he had insulted had the power to erase him with a single decision. And he had. The reality hit them like a slow, painful burn. They had been fired. Not suspended. Not warned. Fired. No second chances. No explanations. Just the cold, hard truth that they had let their prejudice destroy their futures. The customers who had been browsing in the back of the store had heard everything. They stood awkwardly, unsure of what to do, their eyes flickering between the now jobless employees and the door where the billionaire had disappeared. A woman in a designer dress, who had once admired the store's elite atmosphere, felt disgust churn in her stomach. She had been shopping here for years, spending thousands on handbags, shoes, jewelry. But now, she saw the place for what it truly was. A breeding ground for entitlement and quiet racism, disguised as luxury. One by one, the customers put the items they had been holding back on the shelves. Without saying a word, they walked out. Some stole glances at the employees. Others simply shook their heads in disappointment. Minutes passed. Then an hour. No one spoke. The store was empty now, except for the ex-employees, who stood in stunned silence. The same store that had once been bustling with energy now felt cold and abandoned. Then, As if the universe had decided to twist the knife even deeper. The store's phone rang. The blonde woman, still in shock, picked it up without thinking. It was corporate. The voice on the other end was sharp, professional, and emotionless. As you may have realized, the owner has made his decision. Effective immediately. You are to leave the premises. Security will be arriving shortly to escort you out. The blonde woman's hands went clammy. She turned to the others, her voice barely a whisper. They're sending security. The young man's face twisted in disbelief. They're not even giving us a chance. The older employee scoffed bitterly, shaking his head. A chance? You think we deserve one? His voice was laced with regret, his arrogance shattered. He had been in this industry long enough to know. When a billionaire makes a decision, there are no negotiations. Minutes later, 2 security guards entered the store. They weren't aggressive, but they didn't need to be. The mere sight of them was enough. Without a word, the employees gathered their things, their hands shaking as they placed their name tags and store keys on the counter. As they stepped outside, the reality of what had happened fully sank in. They weren't just leaving their jobs. They were leaving behind the power they once held, the ability to judge, to exclude, to decide who was worthy of respect. And the worst part, they had done this to themselves. The billionaire, now seated in his penthouse office, received a message from his assistant. The terminations have been carried out. He nodded, but he felt no satisfaction. There was no joy in this, only a quiet confirmation of what he already knew. The world hadn't changed. Racism was still alive, still insidious, still present in the most unexpected places. But this was a small victory. A reminder that power didn't always come in the form of designer suits and expensive watches. Sometimes real power was in the ability to see through the lies, to expose the truth, and to hold people accountable. He leaned back in his chair, staring out at the city skyline. He had come from nothing, built his empire brick by brick, fought against every stereotype, every assumption. And still, after all these years, he had walked into one of his own stores and been treated like nothing. His phone buzzed again. Another message, this one from a journalist. Sir, I'd like to request an interview regarding today's incident. The video is going viral. He sighed, already knowing what was coming. The footage from the store's security cameras had been leaked. The world was watching now. The comments were flooding in. Some people were outraged, disgusted. Others were trying to justify the employee's behavior, grasping at weak excuses. But the truth was undeniable. They had kicked out a poor old black man, laughed at him, humiliated him, only to learn that he was the billionaire owner of the very place they worked for. And now, they would live with that shame forever. As the sun set over the city, the billionaire closed his laptop and stood. He wasn't finished yet. This was just the beginning. Because real change didn't come from moments like these. It came from what happened next. The next morning, the entire city was talking about what had happened. The headlines were everywhere. News stations ran the story on repeat. Social media was in a frenzy, with people dissecting every second of the leaked footage. The billionaire's name was trending, but not for his wealth or business empire. This time, he had become a symbol of something much bigger. The video captured everything. The condescending smiles of the employees, the sneers, the way they had dismissed him without a second thought, the moment they realized their mistake, and then the billionaire's quiet but devastating response. Viewers across the world reacted with outrage. People who had faced similar discrimination shared their own stories, recounting moments when they had been judged solely by their skin color or the way they dressed. Some expressed anger, others heartbreak, but one thing was clear. This was a conversation that couldn't be ignored. The billionaire, however, remained silent. He ignored calls from news outlets. He declined interview requests. He had never been one to seek the spotlight, and he wasn't about to start now. But behind the scenes, he was working on something far more important. At his headquarters, a team of executives gathered for an emergency meeting. They had all seen the footage, and they knew their boss well enough to understand that he wasn't just going to let this slide. He wasn't the type to settle for firing a few employees and moving on. The billionaire walked in, his expression calm but unreadable. He took a seat at the head of the long glass table and scanned the room, The executive sat in tense silence, waiting for him to speak. "Tell me," he said finally, his voice even, "how many complaints have we received about racial discrimination in our stores?" A woman at the far end of the table hesitated before responding. "Sir, we've gone through the records. Over the past 5 years, there have been multiple complaints. Some were dismissed. Others were settled quietly." The billionaire nodded, as if he had expected this. "How many?" She cleared her throat. "More than 200. A heavy silence fell over the room. Some executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others avoided eye contact. The billionaire let the weight of the number sink in before he spoke again. "And how many of those cases were actually investigated?" The woman hesitated. "Less than 20. This time he didn't nod. Instead, he leaned forward, his fingers interlocking on the table. "So we have a pattern." No one spoke. "Let me make something very clear," he continued. "This is not just about one store. This is about a culture that has been allowed to thrive within this company. A culture of exclusion. A culture of gatekeeping. A culture that sees a black man walk in and immediately assumes he doesn't belong." One of the executives, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, shifted in his chair. "Sir, with all due respect, we have policies in place." The billionaire cut him off with a sharp look. "Policies mean nothing if they aren't enforced." His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. "Tell me something. When I walked into that store, dressed the way I was, how many of you would have assumed I was the owner?" Silence. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Exactly." No one dared to speak. He exhaled slowly, collecting his thoughts. "Effective immediately, we are launching a full-scale internal review. Every store, every region, every employee. I want a complete breakdown of every discrimination complaint ever filed within this company. I want to know how they were handled, who handled them, and why they weren't taken seriously. And most importantly, I want real action." A younger executive, sitting near the center of the table, cleared his throat. "Sir, what kind of action are we talking about?" The billionaire met his gaze. "A complete overhaul. New hiring policies. New training programs. And I don't mean those corporate diversity seminars that do nothing but check a box. I want real education. Real accountability." Another executive spoke up hesitantly. "This could cost millions." The billionaire gave him a look that sent a chill down his spine. "And how much do you think it's already cost us?" No one had an answer. The billionaire stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. But before he walked out, he turned back to face them. "One more thing," he said. "I don't want to hear the word damage control. This isn't about saving face. This is about fixing something that should have been fixed a long time ago." And with that, he left the room. Meanwhile, outside the corporate world, the former employees of the luxury store were dealing with the fallout in their own way. The young man who had dismissed the billionaire had deactivated all his social media accounts after receiving hundreds of messages calling him out. He had tried to defend himself at first, saying he had simply been doing his job, that he hadn't meant any harm. But the internet had no patience for his excuses. The blonde woman, once so confident and entitled, had gone into hiding. She had lost everything: her job, her reputation, and the illusion of superiority she had clung to for so long. Friends who once admired her distanced themselves, afraid of being associated with her. She had never imagined that a single moment of cruelty could lead to such a spectacular downfall. As for the older employee, the one who had outright told the billionaire to leave, he sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the news reports with hollow eyes. He had worked in luxury retail for decades. He had always believed that he knew how the world worked, that he understood the rules. But now, he realized, he had been playing by the wrong rules all along. Days passed. The story refused to die down. More people came forward with similar experiences, recounting how they had been treated unfairly in high-end stores, restaurants, hotels. The conversation had begun, and it wasn't going away. And then, one morning, a new statement was released. The billionaire had announced a major initiative, a multimillion-dollar program aimed at providing business opportunities for underprivileged black entrepreneurs. Grants, mentorships, funding, real, tangible support for those who had been overlooked for too long. The response was immediate. Some praised him. Others accused him of doing it for publicity. But he didn't care about opinions. He had never cared about approval. He cared about results. And as he looked out at the city from his penthouse window, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the world watched as the Billionaire's initiative began taking shape. Applications for grants flooded in from Black entrepreneurs who had long struggled to secure funding from traditional banks and investors. Some of them had been turned away countless times, not because of their business plans, but because of the biases hidden behind polite corporate rejections. Now they had a chance. A real chance. The billionaire personally reviewed many of the applications himself. He read stories of ambition, resilience, and brilliance, ideas that had been buried under the weight of discrimination. There were young men and women with revolutionary tech startups, single mothers with groundbreaking beauty brands, former inmates trying to rebuild their lives through sustainable businesses. Each one had been told, in one way or another, that success wasn't meant for them. Now, they were finally being given the resources they deserved. The first recipients were announced in a widely televised event. The billionaire stood on stage beside them, not as a savior, but as an ally. He didn't give speeches about his generosity or frame himself as the hero of the story. Instead, he made one thing clear. The talent had always been there. The only difference now was that someone was willing to bet on it. Across the country, the ripples of change began to spread. Other corporations, under pressure from the public, started reviewing their own discriminatory practices. Some followed the billionaire's lead and invested in similar programs. Others resisted, but they couldn't ignore the shift in conversation. The luxury fashion industry, which had long been criticized for its exclusionary culture, was forced to confront its biases. More Black models were cast in major campaigns. More Black designers were given a platform. More Black executives were hired into leadership positions, not as tokens, but as decision-makers. Meanwhile, the billionaire's company underwent the overhaul he had demanded. Hiring policies were rewritten. Every employee, from the lowest-ranking sales associate to the highest-level executives, was required to undergo a new kind of training. Not the standard corporate lectures, but immersive programs designed to dismantle deep-seated prejudices. More importantly, a new system was put in place to ensure that any future complaints of discrimination would be taken seriously. The billionaire made one thing clear. If anyone was caught treating a customer unfairly because of race, they wouldn't just be fired. They would be held accountable in every way possible. As all of this unfolded, the luxury store where the incident had occurred remained a ghost town. The scandal had been too big to recover from. Customers refused to shop there. Online reviews destroyed its reputation. The owners had no choice but to shut it down permanently. The once pristine space, where only the right kind of people had been welcomed, now sat empty, a testament to what happens when arrogance and racism go unchecked. And yet, despite everything, there were still those who refused to acknowledge the truth. Some people argued that the billionaire had overreacted, that he had made an example out of a few bad apples, instead of recognizing that racism wasn't as widespread as he claimed. Others accused him of playing the victim, as if the wealth he had built somehow erased the discrimination he had faced. But he didn't waste time responding to them. He knew better than anyone that racism wasn't just about one incident at a store. It was woven into the fabric of society, lurking in boardrooms, hiring decisions, loan approvals, school admissions. One act of justice wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. And so, life moved forward. The billionaire continued his work, investing in Black-owned businesses, mentoring young entrepreneurs, and using his influence to challenge systems that had been rigged for too long. He didn't stop at funding. He helped create networks, ensuring that those he supported had access to the same opportunities that had once been denied to him. But even as the world celebrated his actions, he never forgot the moment that had sparked it all. He would always remember the way they had looked at him, the way they had judged him before he even had a chance to speak, the way they had believed, without hesitation, that a Black man in simple clothes couldn't possibly belong in their world. And so, years later, when he passed by the location where that store once stood, he smiled. The building had been replaced by something new. A community center, funded entirely by him. A place where young black entrepreneurs could gather, learn, and build their futures. A place where no one would ever be judged by their skin color. A place where the next generation wouldn't have to fight the same battles he had. And as he stood there, watching a group of young men and women walk through its doors with hope in their eyes, he knew this was the ending he had always wanted.